It happens without warning. One moment you're a child and the next you're carrying weights no small body was meant to hold. You're 8 years old standing in the kitchen watching your mother stare at bills she can't pay. And something ancient awakens in you, a voice that whispers, "If I don't fix this, everything falls apart." Maybe it's poverty that made you grow up too fast, the kind that teaches you to count coins before you can count your blessings. Maybe it's a parent who was physically present but emotionally absent, leaving you to translate the silence into survival. Or maybe it's just the relentless grinding of a world that needs workers more than it needs children, a world that rewards productivity over play, responsibility over innocence, output over imagination, and without anyone saying it out loud, a silent contract is signed in your nervous system. If I become useful enough, maybe I'll be safe. If I carry enough, maybe I'll be loved. If I disappear into function, maybe I'll finally matter. This is how children vanish, not through tragedy but through premature competence. Not through loss but through the loss of something they don't even know they had. The right to be small, to be held, to be protected. They smile wider to calm storms they didn't create. They learn to read rooms before they can read chapter books. They become emotional thermostats regulating the temperature of everyone else's feelings while their own freeze in place, unacknowledged, unseen, unwelcome. And the world calls this maturity. Teachers praise them. Relatives admire them. "You're so responsible," they say. "You're so wise beyond your years." But no one stops to ask what those years cost. What was sacrificed on the altar of premature adulthood? What dreams were buried beneath the weight of other people's needs? Max Weber didn't write about childhood, but he understood the machinery that devours it. In his analysis of modernity and capitalism, Weber identified something he called instrumental rationality, the process by which every human activity becomes a means to an end, where value is measured not by intrinsic worth but by productivity, efficiency, calculability. Under this logic, even children become resources to be optimized, their spontaneity suppressed, their curiosity redirected toward usefulness, their inherent worth replaced by their functional value. Weber observed that in pre-modern societies, children existed within webs of meaning that honored their developmental stages, their need for play, for imagination, for the gradual unfolding of personhood. But capitalism, with its relentless demand for labor and its valorization of productivity, transformed childhood itself into a period of preparation for economic participation. The child is no longer a being. They become a becoming, valued not for what they are but for what they will produce. This is the invisible machinery that crushes children who grow up too fast. They internalize the logic of instrumental rationality before they even have words for it. They learn that love is conditional upon usefulness, that safety requires performance, that rest is something to be earned rather than freely given. Their small bodies become instruments in service of stability, their nervous systems wired for vigilance rather than joy. And this rewiring doesn't happen through explicit instruction, but through the ambient atmosphere of homes and societies organized around economic survival, where parents, themselves exhausted by the demands of capitalism, unconsciously transmit the message that productivity equals worthiness, that being functional is more important than being whole. Weber would recognize this as the iron cage in miniature, the internalization of rational discipline so complete that it shapes consciousness itself, teaching children to become their own overseers long before any boss or institution needs to control them. When you grow up too fast in a world built for work, you don't just lose your childhood, you lose your sense of intrinsic value. You learn that your worth is tied to what you produce, what you fix, what you manage, what you carry. This creates what psychologists now call hyper-independence, but Weber would see it as something more structural, the logical outcome of a social order that prizes self-sufficiency over interdependence, individual responsibility over collective care. You become a miniature capitalist subject, internalizing the belief that asking for help is weakness, that vulnerability is dangerous, that your needs are burdens no one should have to carry. This isn't personal pathology, it's social pathology made personal. The values of an economic system inscribed into your developing brain, shaping how you relate to yourself and others for decades to come. You become an efficiency machine in human form, Always optimizing, always producing, always striving to be enough by never being enough. Weber identified this pattern in his famous analysis of the Protestant work ethic, showing how religious beliefs about salvation through diligent labor gradually secularized into a cultural obsession with productivity for its own sake. What began as a spiritual calling, a vocation blessed by divine approval, eventually became work as an end in itself, stripped of transcendent meaning, but retaining all its psychological intensity. The child who grows up too fast inherits this Protestant ethic in its most distilled and destructive form, learning that rest is sin, that play is frivolous, that one's value is measured by output rather than being. They carry the ghost of Calvinist anxiety, forever uncertain whether they're doing enough, whether they're good enough, whether their efforts will ever earn them the love and security they desperately need, but can never quite believe they deserve. As you listen to this, ask yourself, do you remember the moment you stopped being a child? Was there a specific day when responsibility replaced wonder, when duty eclipsed joy, when you looked in the mirror and saw an adult staring back from eyes too young to hold that weight? Perhaps it was the day you realized your parents couldn't protect you from the economic realities pressing against your home. Perhaps it was the afternoon you came home to find your mother crying, and knew instinctively that your job was to make everything okay. Or perhaps it happened so gradually you can't pinpoint when, like a photograph slowly developing in chemical solution, the image of your adult self emerging while the child beneath it faded into background, present but invisible, there but not seen. Weber wrote extensively about the disenchantment of the world, the process by which modernity strips existence of mystery, magic, spontaneity, replacing these with calculation, prediction, control. For children forced to grow up too fast, disenchantment happens on a personal scale before they even understand it's happening. The world loses its wonder not because they outgrow imagination, but because imagination becomes a luxury they can't afford. Play becomes frivolous when survival feels uncertain. Curiosity becomes dangerous when stability requires conformity. Joy becomes suspicious when every moment of letting go might mean disaster. Weber observed that rationalization creates societies where people are highly functional, but deeply alienated, performing their roles with technical precision while experiencing profound disconnection from meaning, from others, from themselves. The child who becomes a little adult experiences this alienation in its most intimate form, functioning beautifully while feeling fundamentally alone, competent on the surface while terrified underneath, praised for their strength while secretly longing for permission to fall apart. This creates what Weber might call a contradiction at the heart of capitalist childhood. On one hand, modernity celebrates the ideal of protected childhood, the notion that children should be shielded from adult concerns, allowed to play, to learn, to develop gradually. On the other hand, economic realities and cultural values create conditions where many children must contribute functionally to household stability, either through emotional labor, practical responsibility, or premature self-sufficiency. This contradiction is rarely acknowledged explicitly, which means the child who grows up too fast carries not only the burden of adult responsibility, but also the confusion of being praised for something that is simultaneously damaging them. They're told they're amazing for being so mature while their developmental needs go unmet. They're rewarded with approval for sacrificing their childhood while being denied the resources that genuine maturity requires. Because children will do anything for attachment, even abandon themselves. The psychology of parentification, where children take on adult roles in service of family stability, reveals a survival strategy so intelligent it appears voluntary. The child doesn't consciously decide to become their parent's confidant, their sibling's caretaker, the household's emotional regulator. Instead, they unconsciously calculate that this is the price of belonging, the cost of not being abandoned, the only way to guarantee connection in an environment where love feels conditional. Weber understood that rational action isn't always conscious, that people make calculations based on their reading of social structures without necessarily articulating those calculations to themselves. The child who grows up too fast is performing a rational survival strategy within the structure they find themselves in, maximizing their chances of security by becoming maximally useful. But the tragedy, as Weber would recognize, is that this rationality is adaptive to a pathological system, which means it serves immediate survival while undermining long-term flourishing. What saved you then imprisons you now. This is the paradox at the heart of premature adulthood. The hypervigilance that protected you from chaos becomes the anxiety that prevents you from trusting peace. The self-sufficiency that kept you safe becomes the isolation that keeps you lonely. The ability to read rooms and regulate emotions becomes the burden of feeling responsible for everyone's feelings but your own. These adaptations were brilliant in context, evidence of your resilience, your intelligence, your will to survive. But survival strategies optimized for childhood dysfunction become maladaptive in adult relationships and work environments designed for different dynamics. You bring weapons to situations that need vulnerability, armor to moments that need openness, hypercompetence to relationships that need interdependence. And because these patterns are deeply encoded in your nervous system, you often don't recognize them as strategies at all. They feel like who you are, like your personality, your natural way of being in the world. Weber would recognize this as the routinization of charisma in personal life, the process by which what begins as an adaptive response to crisis becomes institutionalized into permanent character structure. Just as charismatic movements eventually become bureaucratic organizations that replicate themselves through routine rather than inspiration, your childhood adaptations become automated patterns that replicate themselves across your adult life, regardless of whether they still serve you. You continue performing the role of the reliable one, the strong one, the one who never needs help, not because current circumstances require it, but because the script was written decades ago, and you've been following it ever since. This creates a particular kind of suffering that Weber understood well, the suffering of being trapped in structures that no longer match your needs, but which you lack the resources or awareness to escape. In adulthood, the child who grew up too fast often becomes someone who excels professionally while struggling personally. They're promoted quickly because they're responsible, dependable, willing to take on extra work without complaint. They become the person everyone relies on, the one who holds teams together, the one who can be counted on in crisis. But underneath this competence is exhaustion so profound it feels like a second skeleton, invisible to others but weighing down every movement. Weber's concept of the iron cage describes this perfectly, the way rational systems create structures that trap individuals within roles they can't escape even when those roles are destroying them. You built the cage yourself, bar by bar, through hyper-responsibility, through perfectionism, through the belief that your value is contingent on your usefulness, and now you're so identified with the cage that you can't imagine existing outside it. Who would you be if you weren't the strong one, the reliable one, the one who fixes everything? The question terrifies you because the answer might be no one, nothing, invisible. Here, write in the comments, I forgot how to just be. This simple sentence captures what so many people feel but struggle to articulate. If you recognize yourself in this description, if you can't remember the last time you did something purely for joy rather than productivity, if rest feels like laziness and asking for help feels like failure, then write that sentence. Let it be witnessed. Because one of the most damaging aspects of growing up too fast is the isolation of believing you're the only one, that everyone else received an instruction manual for healthy adulthood that you somehow missed. But the truth is that millions of people are carrying this same burden, performing functionality while feeling fraudulent, succeeding externally while collapsing internally. Sharing your experience isn't weakness, it's breaking the silence that keeps this pattern invisible. It's refusing to carry alone what was never yours to carry in the first place. Weber observed that capitalism creates what he called specialists without spirit, people who perform their technical roles brilliantly, but who have lost touch with broader questions of meaning, purpose, value. The child who grows up too fast often becomes this kind of specialist, expert at functioning but disconnected from their own desires, skilled at meeting others' needs but unable to identify their own, capable of managing complexity but confused when someone asks, "What do you actually want?" This isn't a personal failing. It's a structural outcome of being trained from childhood to prioritize utility over authenticity, function over feeling, productivity over presence. You learned early that there's no time for self-discovery when survival is at stake, no space for exploring desires when duty demands your attention. No permission to be confused or uncertain when everyone needs you to be the one with answers. This creates a particular relationship with control that Weber would recognize as deeply rational and deeply destructive. When your childhood was characterized by chaos, unpredictability, or emotional instability, your nervous system learned that the only safety comes from hyper-control, from making everything just right, from leaving nothing to chance. You become someone who needs plans, routines, structures, not because you're naturally rigid, but because rigidity was the only way to create islands of predictability in an ocean of chaos. As an adult, this manifests as difficulty with spontaneity, discomfort with uncertainty, anxiety when plans change, a need to manage and organize and control every variable you possibly can. People might call you type A or perfectionistic, but underneath these labels is a traumatized nervous system still trying to prevent the chaos it once endured. Weber understood that rational behavior is often rooted in non-rational fears, that what looks like preference is often adaptation to conditions we had no power to change. But here's where Weber's analysis becomes both painful and potentially liberating. He argued that while rationalization creates iron cages, awareness of the cage is the first step toward reclaiming agency within it. You can't escape structures completely. There's no outside to the social systems that shape us, but you can develop what Weber called value-rational action, behavior guided not by instrumental calculation, but by commitment to chosen values and meanings. This distinction is crucial for healing the wounds of premature adulthood. Instrumental rationality asks, what action will produce the desired outcome? It's the logic you learned as a child. I'll be useful, so I'll be loved. I'll be perfect, so I'll be safe. I'll carry everything, so nothing will fall apart. Value-rational action asks instead, what action aligns with what I actually value, regardless of whether it produces external rewards? It's the logic of adulthood you never got to learn. The logic that says I matter because I exist, not because of what I produce. That rest is a human right, not something I have to earn. That my needs are legitimate even when meeting them doesn't benefit anyone else. The shift from instrumental to value rationality requires grieving, and this grief is rarely acknowledged because the loss is invisible. You didn't lose a person or a place. You lost a developmental stage. You lost the experience of being cared for without having to earn it, of making mistakes without catastrophic consequences, of being held emotionally while you figured out who you were. This is what psychologists call ambiguous loss, grief for something that was never tangibly present but whose absence shaped everything. Weber might call it the loss of enchantment on a personal scale, the loss of a world where you could be simply and fully yourself without calculation, without performance, without the constant assessment of whether you're being enough. And because this loss happened so early, you might not even recognize it as loss. It might feel like just the way things are, like reality itself rather than a reality that was imposed upon you. Healing doesn't mean recovering what was lost. Childhood can't be reclaimed. Time doesn't move backward. Instead, healing means developing a relationship with your inner child that provides retroactively what they needed then: protection, permission to rest, validation that their needs mattered, acknowledgement that they shouldn't have had to carry what they carried. This isn't indulgent psychology. It's restructuring the internalized relationships that shape your current functioning. Weber understood that even when external structures can't be changed, internal meaning-making can transform how we experience those structures. You can't change that you grew up too fast, but you can change the story you tell about what that means, moving from, I had to be strong because I was the only one who could, to, I survived by being strong, and now I'm learning that I'm worthy of care even when I'm not being strong. One of Weber's most important insights was about the relationship between freedom and structure. He argued against both naive libertarianism, the belief that freedom means absence of all constraint, and determinism, the belief that structures completely determine outcomes. Instead, he proposed that freedom exists in the space of choosing how to relate to the structures we can't escape. You can't undo your childhood. You can't unlearn the hypervigilance, erase the patterns, or pretend you didn't develop the survival strategies you needed. But you can develop what Weber might call elective affinity with different values, deliberately choosing to align yourself with beliefs and practices that honor your wholeness rather than just your functionality. This might mean choosing rest, even when your nervous system screams that rest is dangerous. It might mean asking for help even when every fiber of your being insists that needing help equals weakness. It might mean disappointing people, setting boundaries, saying no, letting things fall apart instead of holding everything together. These acts feel revolutionary because they're revolutions against the internal regime that says your value is contingent, that love is transactional, that you're only safe when you're useful. Because capitalism requires workers, not whole human beings, Weber understood that the economic system depends on people internalizing certain values while suppressing others. It needs people who show up on time, who follow rules, who defer gratification, who equate their worth with their productivity. These values aren't natural or inevitable. They're historically constructed and culturally transmitted, often through families that are themselves struggling to survive within capitalist structures. When parents are exhausted, when economic insecurity looms, when there aren't enough resources to meet everyone's needs, children naturally become conscripted into the family's economic and emotional labor. They don't choose this conscription, but they make the best of it, developing skills and strategies that help the family unit survive. The tragedy is that these survival skills become identity, these strategies become personality, and what was adaptive in childhood becomes constricting in adulthood. Weber wrote about the Protestant ethics transformation of work from means to end, from something you did to survive into something that defined your worth. The child who grew up too fast inherits this ethic in its purest, most undiluted form. Work becomes not just what you do, but who you are. Productivity becomes not just valued, but valorized. Rest becomes not just unnecessary, but morally suspect. And underneath this relentless doing is a child still trying to earn the love that should have been freely given, still trying to be good enough to deserve safety, still trying to prove that they matter by demonstrating their utility. This is exhausting not just physically but existentially, because you can never rest into being. You're always performing, becoming. Always one productive act away from worthiness, but never actually arriving at a place where you can simply be. The armadillo has armor because it's vulnerable. You have hypercompetence because you were unprotected. Your strength isn't the opposite of your vulnerability. It's the evidence of it. This reframe is crucial because so much healing advice tells you to embrace your vulnerability, as if that's something separate from your strength. But Weber's analysis suggests something different. Your adaptations aren't masks hiding your true self. They're part of your true self, forged in response to real conditions that demanded real solutions. The question isn't whether to discard your strength, but whether to expand your repertoire beyond it. Whether to develop the capacity to also be soft, uncertain, dependent, imperfect, without experiencing these states as existential threats. This is integration, not replacement, adding flexibility to your strength rather than replacing strength with vulnerability. Weber identified 3 types of legitimate authority in social structures: traditional, charismatic, and rational legal. In families where children grow up too fast, a kind of charismatic authority emerges where the child's apparent maturity and competence give them power and responsibility, far exceeding their developmental stage. Parents might unconsciously treat the child as a peer, confiding adult problems, seeking emotional support, relying on the child's judgment in ways that invert the natural hierarchy of care. The child experiences this as power. They matter, they're needed, they're important, but it's a poison power, because it comes at the cost of their own needs being subordinated to the system's stability. Weber understood that authority always involves some form of domination, even when it appears consensual, and the child who is elevated to premature authority is simultaneously dominated by the expectations that elevation creates. This pattern extends into adult relationships, where you might find yourself repeatedly attracted to people who need fixing, who are struggling, who require your competence and care. This isn't masochism or low self-esteem. It's the repetition of the only form of intimacy you learned: love as rescue, connection as utility, mattering through being needed. Weber would recognize this as the routinization of your childhood dynamic, the way your earliest template for relationship becomes the blueprint you unconsciously follow, seeking variations on a familiar theme rather than genuinely new experiences. Breaking this pattern requires not just recognizing it intellectually, but grieving the fantasy that if you just fix the right person well enough, they'll finally give you the unconditional love you needed as a child. That fantasy is the child's hope preserved in amber. beautiful and heartbreaking and impossible because adults can't give you childhood experiences. They can only offer adult forms of connection that require adult capacities for reciprocity. One of Weber's most challenging insights was that disenchantment, while painful, also creates conditions for certain kinds of freedom. When the world is no longer governed by magic, mystery, or unquestioned tradition, individuals face the burden of creating their own meanings, choosing their own values, taking responsibility for the worlds they construct through their choices. The child who grew up too fast experienced premature disenchantment, losing innocence and wonder before they'd fully inhabited them. But this early loss, while tragic, also created a certain kind of vision, the ability to see through social facades, to recognize dysfunction that others normalize, to understand that the way things are isn't the way things have to be. Many children who grew up too fast become adults with unusually clear perception about psychological dynamics, family systems, power relations. They develop this perception as a survival skill, needing to read subtle cues to predict danger and maintain safety. Now that perception can serve different purposes, not just survival, but conscious choice about what kind of life to build. This is where the dangerous knowledge becomes potentially transformative. Weber believed that sociology itself was dangerous because it revealed the constructed nature of social realities that most people experience as natural and inevitable. Similarly, understanding that your childhood adaptations were responses to specific conditions rather than reflections of your inherent nature is dangerous knowledge because it destabilizes your entire sense of self. If your competence was a survival strategy rather than your essence, who are you beneath it? If your strength was armor rather than identity, what does it protect? If your hyper-independence was adaptation rather than personality, what kind of interdependence might become possible? These questions are terrifying because they suggest that the self you've built so carefully, the self that works so hard to be enough, might itself be a cage requiring examination. Weber wrote that there is no such thing as a presuppositionless science, that all inquiry begins from value commitments that shape what we consider worth studying and how we interpret what we find. Similarly, there's no presuppositionless healing. The frameworks you use to understand your childhood shape what becomes possible in your adulthood. If you understand your history through the lens of personal pathology, you'll spend your life trying to fix something broken in you. If you understand it through the lens of Weberian sociology, you'll recognize yourself as someone who adapted brilliantly to structures that shouldn't have existed, whose supposed dysfunctions are actually evidence of intelligence, creativity, and resilience operating under impossible conditions. This doesn't make the pain less real, but it changes the meaning of the pain, moving from something is wrong with me to something was wrong with what happened to me, and I'm working to build something different now. At what cost does efficiency come? Weber asked this about capitalism, about rationalization, about the whole modern project of organizing society according to calculability and control. You might ask it about your own life, about the years you spent being responsible, capable, strong, about the relationships you maintained by always being the stable one, about the achievements you accumulated by never stopping to rest. What did that efficiency cost? Perhaps it cost you the ability to trust that people would stay even when you weren't useful. Perhaps it cost you the experience of being loved messily, imperfectly, unconditionally. Perhaps it cost you the knowledge that you matter simply because you exist, not because of what you do or who you help or how much you carry. Weber argued that rational systems create what he called specialists without spirit, sensualists without heart, and he worried that modernity was creating a world of people who could function brilliantly, but couldn't feel fully. The child who grew up too fast becomes this specialist, expert at doing but confused about being, skilled at producing but uncertain about receiving, capable of giving endlessly, but terrified of needing anything. If your childhood taught you that love is conditional upon performance, that safety requires constant vigilance, that rest is something you earn rather than deserve, then your adult task is learning a different grammar, a different syntax of relationship and worth. This learning is complicated by the fact that the world you inhabit as an adult, the workplaces, the economic structures, the cultural values, often reinforces the lessons your childhood taught. Capitalism wants you to believe your worth is tied to your productivity. Consumer culture wants you exhausted and anxious so you'll keep buying solutions. And so the internal wound meets external conditions that keep it open, making healing not just a personal project but a kind of resistance to systems that benefit from your continued dysfunction. Weber understood that change requires both individual transformation and structural critique, that you can't fully heal in isolation from addressing the systems that created the wound. This doesn't mean you have to become an activist, but it does mean recognizing that your struggle is not merely personal, it's political, economic, cultural, shaped by forces far larger than your family of origin. The question Weber posed to his students still resonates today, in a world growing increasingly rationalized and disenchanted. How do we create lives of meaning and value? For those who grew up too fast, this question has particular urgency because meaning-making was interrupted, because the developmental stage where you should have been exploring values and forming identity was instead devoted to survival and utility. Reclaiming that interrupted development means giving yourself permission to be curious about your own desires, to experiment with different ways of being, to make mistakes without catastrophic consequences, to discover who you might become when you're not performing a role written by your childhood circumstances. This isn't childish. It's reclaiming the childhood work you never got to do, the work of play, of exploration, of trying on different selves without commitment, of being held while you figure out who you are. Because children learn about their worth through mirror neurons, through seeing themselves reflected in their caregiver's eyes. The child who grew up too fast often saw themselves reflected as useful, competent, mature, strong. They didn't see themselves as precious, as delightful, as worthy of care simply for existing. This creates what attachment theorists call a working model of self, an internal template that shapes how you relate to yourself and expect others to relate to you. Changing this working model requires experiences that contradict it, relationships where people choose to be with you, not because of what you do, but because of who you are, moments where you're valued in your uncertainty rather than just your competence, connections where your needs are met without having to earn that care through service. These experiences feel strange at first, suspicious even, because they contradict your deepest assumptions about how relationship works. But over time, with repetition and intention, new neural pathways form, new templates develop, and the possibility emerges of relating to yourself with the tenderness you needed as a child, but never received. Weber argued that the modern world creates conditions of increasing rationalization, where more and more of life becomes subject to calculation, control, and instrumental reasoning. But he also believed in the possibility of what he called value-rational action, behavior guided by commitment to intrinsic values rather than instrumental goals. For healing the wounds of premature adulthood, this distinction is crucial. Instrumental healing would ask, what do I need to do to feel better, to function better, to be more successful? Value-rational healing asks instead, what kind of person do I want to become? What values do I want to embody? What kind of relationships do I want to participate in, regardless of whether these align with external definitions of success or productivity? This shift moves healing from achievement to embodiment, from doing to being, from performing recovery to actually living differently. One of the most painful recognitions is that your parents, who should have protected your childhood, were themselves likely victims of systems they didn't create and couldn't escape. Perhaps they worked brutal hours because economic survival demanded it. Perhaps they were emotionally unavailable because their own childhoods taught them that vulnerability is dangerous. Perhaps they relied on you because they had no other support, because social safety nets were shredded, because the village that supposedly raises children had long since been destroyed by individualism and economic pressure. Weber's analysis doesn't excuse this. Understanding doesn't equal absolution, but it does complicate the narrative of blame, suggesting that your childhood was shaped not just by individual failings, but by structural conditions that harmed your whole family. This recognition can be liberating because it means you're not fighting just your personal history. You're fighting inheritance. You're fighting systems. You're fighting the accumulated weight of capitalism's demand, that individuals bear burdens that should be collective. Should you forgive? Weber would say that's a value question, not an empirical one, a question that sociology can inform, but not answer. Forgiveness might bring peace, or it might bypass necessary anger. Maintaining boundaries might protect you, or it might perpetuate isolation. There are no universal prescriptions, only your ongoing negotiation between your needs, your values, and the realities you navigate. What matters is that your choices become increasingly conscious, increasingly aligned with who you want to be rather than who you had to become. This is agency not as freedom from constraints, but as freedom within them. The distinctly Weberian notion that while we can't escape social structures entirely, we can choose how to relate to them, what meanings to make of them, what values to embody within them. The child who grew up too fast often becomes an adult who struggles with joy. When happiness arrives, it feels suspicious, fragile, like something that will be snatched away the moment you fully feel it. This makes sense. Your childhood taught you that good moments were temporary, that safety was illusion, that letting your guard down meant danger. So even when external circumstances are genuinely safe, your nervous system remains unconvinced, flooding you with anxiety in the middle of happy occasions, whispering that you should prepare for disaster even when there's no evidence of threat. Weber would recognize this as the internalization of external chaos, the way precarious conditions become permanent psychic structures long after the conditions themselves have changed. Healing this requires what trauma therapists call renegotiation, experiences where your nervous system learns that safety can be real, that joy can last, that you can lower your guard without catastrophe. But this learning happens slowly, through repeated experiences that contradict your expectations, through relationships that remain stable even when you're vulnerable, through moments where you risk trusting and discover that trust can sometimes, just sometimes, be warranted. But here lies a paradox Weber understood well. The same structures that wound us also give us certain capabilities, certain kinds of vision that others lack. Your premature adulthood gave you the ability to perceive dynamics others miss, to sense emotional undercurrents, to navigate complexity, to hold space for others' pain because you know intimately what pain feels like. These aren't justifications for what happened to you. You shouldn't have had to develop these skills the way you did. But they are real capabilities, real strengths that emerged from your struggle. Weber called this the irony of rationalization, that the same processes that restrict also enable, that the cage is also a shelter, that the wound is also a door. You don't have to be grateful for your trauma, but you can acknowledge that you forged something valuable from it, not because the trauma was good, but because you were resilient, creative, and determined to survive. 3 armadillos wait for children who grew up too fast. 3 traps that can derail your healing even as you commit to it. Armadillo 1. The savior complex. Because you learned to maintain stability by fixing others, you might become addicted to being needed, seeking out relationships where people require rescue, where your competence is essential, where you can replay the only form of love you learned. This isn't altruism, it's repetition compulsion. The trap is that you'll exhaust yourself helping people who didn't ask for help, while avoiding the vulnerability of receiving care yourself. Weber would see this as your childhood role becoming your adult identity, preventing the differentiation necessary for genuine intimacy. Healing means learning to form relationships based on mutual reciprocity rather than rescue dynamics, which requires tolerating the anxiety of not being essential, not being needed, not being the strong one. Armadillo 2. The productivity addiction. Because your worth was tied to usefulness, you might become someone who can't stop working, achieving, producing, optimizing. Rest feels like laziness. Stillness feels like failure. You measure your days by output rather than experience, by accomplishments rather than presence. This makes you functionally successful while experientially impoverished, climbing ladders that reach nowhere meaningful because you never stopped to ask where you wanted to go. Weber's concept of specialists without spirit describes this perfectly. People who excel at means while forgetting about ends, who become expert at doing while losing touch with being. The trap is that capitalism rewards this addiction, promoting you, praising you, reinforcing the very patterns that are slowly killing you. Healing means developing the capacity to simply be, to exist without producing, to matter without achieving, to reclaim the childhood permission to play, to rest, to waste time gloriously and without purpose. Armadillo 3. The self-sufficiency prison. Because asking for help felt dangerous, you might become someone who refuses all support, who insists on doing everything alone, who experiences dependency as weakness. This creates isolation disguised as independence, loneliness dressed up as strength. You push away the very connections you need while wondering why you feel so alone. Weber understood that no one is truly self-sufficient, that humans are fundamentally social beings whose flourishing requires relationship, reciprocity, mutual care. The trap is that by refusing to need anyone, you prevent others from knowing you fully, from seeing beneath your competence to your vulnerability, from loving you in your weakness, not just your strength. Healing means gradually, terrifyingly learning to ask for help, to admit you don't have all the answers, to lean on others without collapsing, to discover that interdependence isn't failure but maturity, the adult version of the childhood care you never received. Who do you become when you stop performing the role your childhood assigned? This is the question Weber's analysis makes possible but can't answer for you. Because beneath your competence, your strength, your hyper-responsibility, there's a person you've never fully met, the person you might have become if you'd been allowed to simply be a child, to explore, to make mistakes, to discover your own desires, rather than adapting to everyone else's needs. That person isn't gone, they're buried, waiting. And the work of healing is the work of excavation, of carefully removing layer after layer of adaptation to discover what's underneath, not some perfect true self. Weber would reject that essentialism, but something more real, more chosen, more aligned with values you've deliberately embraced rather than unconsciously inherited. This is integration, bringing together the survival strategies that saved you with new capacities for softness, for trust, for receiving, creating a more complete version of yourself that honors both what you survived and what you're becoming. Weber believed that understanding social structures doesn't determine action, but creates conditions for meaningful choice. Similarly, understanding your childhood patterns doesn't automatically change them, but it creates space for agency, for the possibility of choosing differently, for asking in each moment, am I responding to what's actually happening now, or am I responding to what happened then? This questioning becomes a practice, a form of ongoing self-awareness that gradually shifts automatic reactions into conscious choices. When someone offers help and your instinct is to refuse, you can pause and ask, is accepting help actually dangerous right now? Or does it just feel dangerous because of what I learned long ago? When rest beckons and guilt arrives, you can investigate, do I actually need to keep working, or is my nervous system replaying old messages about productivity and worth? This practice doesn't eliminate your patterns, but it creates tiny spaces of freedom within them, moments where different choices become possible. The child you were deserves acknowledgement. They survived by being strong when they should have been held, by being competent when they should have been protected, by disappearing their needs when they should have been centered. That child is still inside you, not metaphorically but neurologically, encoded in your nervous system, your attachment patterns, your deepest assumptions about safety and love. Healing doesn't mean rescuing that child. You can't change the past, but it means finally offering them what they needed then, even if you can only give it now. It means saying, I see you. I see how hard you tried. I see what you carried that no child should carry. I see your exhaustion beneath your competence, your fear beneath your strength, your longing beneath your self-sufficiency. You didn't deserve what happened. You were just a child. And now I'm here, and I'm not leaving, and you finally get to rest. Weber once wrote that modern rationalization creates specialists without spirit, sensualists without heart, and that this nullity imagines it has attained a level of development never before achieved. The child who grew up too fast becomes a specialist in functionality, but a novice in fulfillment, expert at doing but uncertain about being, highly developed in competence but underdeveloped in wholeness. Your healing isn't about becoming less competent. It's about developing the capacities that got stunted when you had to be an adult too soon. The capacity for play, for spontaneity, for trust, for accepting care, for believing that you matter, even when you're not useful. This is the development you actually need. Not more achievement, but more integration. Not more strength, but more flexibility. Not more control, but more capacity to surrender to moments that require softness rather than armor. Do you ever wonder who you might have become if you'd been allowed to simply be a child? If you'd been protected instead of protector? If you'd played instead of performed? If you'd been held in your uncertainty instead of praised for your premature maturity? This wondering isn't about regret. It's about recognition, acknowledging the road not taken, the self not developed, the childhood not lived. And while you can't recover what was lost, you can make different choices now. You can choose to protect the child you were by becoming the adult you needed. You can choose to honor their sacrifice by living differently than they had to live. You can choose to break the cycle, not by rejecting your strength, but by expanding beyond it, by adding softness to your repertoire, vulnerability to your toolkit, rest to your rhythm. This is how you heal, not by fixing what's broken, but by developing what was stunted, not by becoming someone else, but by becoming more fully yourself. Weber argued that modern life creates iron cages of rationality, from which there is no escape, only more or less conscious inhabitation. Your childhood created its own iron cage, its own set of rigid rules about worth, safety, love, and belonging. You've inhabited this cage so long it feels like home, like the only possible architecture for a life. But here's the truth Weber also knew. Awareness of the cage changes your relationship to it. When you recognize that your hyper-responsibility is a learned strategy rather than inherent truth, when you see that your self-sufficiency is adaptation rather than identity, when you understand that your strength was forged in response to conditions that shouldn't have existed, then suddenly the cage reveals itself as construct rather than nature, as something made rather than given, as something that, while difficult to escape, might be modified, expanded, or related to differently. You might never be fully free of the patterns your childhood created, but you can become increasingly conscious of them, increasingly able to choose when they serve you and when they don't, increasingly capable of living within constraints while maintaining your autonomy. The greatest gift you can give yourself is permission. Permission to rest without earning it, permission to need without apologizing, permission to be imperfect without being unworthy, permission to take up space without being useful, permission to be soft after years of being strong, permission to finally stop holding everything together and discover that you don't fall apart, or that if you do fall apart, someone might actually be there to help you pick up the pieces. Weber understood that permission is always granted within structures, that absolute freedom is impossible. But relative freedom, freedom within limits, freedom to choose your relationship to necessity, that kind of freedom is available even within the iron cage. And for the child who grew up too fast, for the adult still carrying that child's burdens, that freedom might look like the simple radical act of saying, I've been strong enough for long enough, and today I choose something different. So here's what healing looks like. It looks like crying in public without apologizing. It looks like asking for help even though your hands are shaking. It looks like saying no without justification or explanation. It looks like resting on a Tuesday afternoon without tying your worth to productivity. It looks like being messy, uncertain, confused, vulnerable, and believing that you're still worthy of love. It looks like disappointing people who are used to you being strong. It looks like letting things fall apart instead of holding them together. It looks like choosing yourself even when that choice makes others uncomfortable. It looks like all the things that terrify you precisely because they contradict everything your childhood taught you about how to survive. But you're not trying to survive anymore. You're trying to live, actually live, fully live. And that requires different skills than the ones you developed at 7 years old when the world demanded you become an adult before you were ready. If this resonates, if you've recognized yourself in this exploration of premature adulthood and Weberian analysis, then I want you to know that this channel is dedicated to exactly this work, using classical sociology, depth psychology, and spiritual wisdom to understand the structures that shape us and the possibilities for choosing differently within those structures. Subscribe if you want to continue exploring how thinkers like Weber can illuminate your personal struggles and point toward genuine transformation. Because this isn't just theory, this is your life. This is the cage you've lived in, and the freedom that becomes possible when you understand how the cage was built and why it feels so permanent. The work we do here isn't about quick fixes or easy answers. It's about developing the dangerous knowledge that changes everything. The knowledge that what you thought was your nature is actually your adaptation, and that different adaptations, different ways of being, remain possible even now. Your childhood is over, but your life is not. The roles you played, the weight you carried, the needs you suppressed, these shaped you, but they don't have to define you forever. Weber's most important insight was that consciousness changes relationship, that understanding the structures that constrain us creates possibilities for agency within those structures. You cannot undo your childhood, but you can develop a different relationship to its legacy. You can honor what you survived while refusing to keep living as if you're still in survival mode. You can acknowledge your strength while developing your capacity for vulnerability. You can be grateful for the skills you forged while mourning the childhood you deserved but didn't receive. This is integration. This is wholeness. This is the work of becoming, not innocent again. Innocence can't be recovered, but conscious, choosing, capable of relating to yourself and others with compassion rather than just competence, with presence rather than just productivity, with being rather than just doing. And if you're wondering where to go from here, if this video has opened something in you that now needs further exploration, then watch my next video on Weber's concept of disenchantment and how modern rationalization creates spiritual emptiness even in material abundance. Because the child who grew up too fast often becomes an adult who succeeds according to every external metric, while feeling profoundly empty inside, checking boxes while losing meaning, achieving goals while forgetting why those goals mattered. Weber's analysis of disenchantment explains this emptiness not as personal failure but as structural condition, and points toward possibilities for re-enchantment even within the rationalized world we inherit. That's the next step in understanding how your childhood patterns connect to larger cultural and economic forces, and how awareness of those forces creates space for genuine transformation. Thank you for being here, for doing this difficult work of excavation and examination, for having the courage to look at what your childhood demanded of you, and what your adulthood might offer instead. This isn't easy work, but it's the work that matters, the work of reclaiming yourself from the roles you had to play, the work of becoming who you might have been if you'd been given the childhood you deserved. Keep going, keep questioning, keep choosing consciousness over automaticity, keep honoring both your strength and your need for softness. You're not broken, you're not too much, you're not damaged beyond repair. You're someone who survived by becoming strong, and now you're learning that you're also worthy of being soft. That's not weakness. That's completion. That's not regression. That's development. That's not giving up your strength. That's finally becoming whole. See you in the next dimension of understanding.